Good afternoon. My name is Joshua Mitchell. I teach in the Government Department at Georgetown University in Washington. I'd like to speak with you today about identity politics. Let me begin with a quote from Solzhenitsyn. If humanism were right in declaring that man is born to be happy, he would not be born to die. Since his body is doomed to die, his task on earth evidently must be of a more spiritual nature. Now, by so many measures, life is getting better all the time. There have been no global wars in the last 7 decades. Standards of living have increased nearly everywhere, well beyond anything imaginable at the end of World War II. Many diseases have been eradicated. Starvation is rarer. Drinking water is more readily available. Housing stock has multiplied, and modern conveniences have grown exponentially. Travel by every means is safer. International communication is instantaneous and inexpensive. The computing power of the common smartphone exceeds the computing power the astronauts of Apollo 11 had at their disposal during the first landing on the moon in 1969. Alongside the visible material economy that has made these improvements possible lies another economy that is also concerned with weighing and measuring. In this economy, however, we do not weigh and measure things like money, time, and materials. Rather, we seek to measure transgression and innocence. Sometimes with a view to the mystery that no balance of payments between them is possible, and sometimes with a view to the demand that all accounts be settled. I will say more about both of these views in a moment. For now, I will say that this invisible economy is uncorrelated to the economic advances that we make, and therefore, that with the happiness and well-being that is supposed to be ours. Strangely enough, this visible economy also seems to obtrude all the more as our standards of living increase. Perhaps this is because when we attempt to build a world in which the only things we weigh and measure are money, time, and materials, we momentarily deceive ourselves that this is the only economy in which we are involved. Then, because we can never escape its primordial tug, the invisible economy concerned with weighing and measuring transgression and innocence disrupts and mocks the well-measured world of time, money, and materials that we have constructed, and then demands our full attention. Alexis de Tocqueville, the great author of Democracy in America, seemed to think that this twofold economy was always going to haunt us. In 1840, he wrote, "The soul has its needs that must be satisfied. Whatever pains are taken to distract it from itself, it soon grows bored, restless, and anxious amid the pleasures of the senses. If ever the thoughts of the great majority of mankind came to be concentrated solely on the search for material blessings, one can anticipate that there would be a colossal reaction in the souls of men. They would distractedly launch out into the world of spirits for fear of being held too tightly bound by the body's fetters." In the United States, material prosperity was measured and loved more than anything else, anywhere else at that time. Because if this was the case, there would be periodic and enthusiastic eruptions of the invisible economy, Tocqueville thought. Religious enthusiasm, here understood as the acute awareness of our transgressions, and the frenetic search for the cover of innocence, goes with material opulence. From the vantage point of the material world, as many economists remind us, we should be happier by the day. Because the economy to which they point is not the only one in which we live, we're not happier. Man, the material being who knows the material world, is not the only measure of who he is. Furnished with material advances that lift him up to unimaginable heights, and haunted by an unpaid and unpayable debt from his transgressions, which draw him into wretched darkness from which he cannot escape, that is man. This twofold economy of ours, the one visible and the other invisible, is quite clearly on display these days if we know where to look. I mentioned a moment ago that sometimes the invisible economy is understood in light of the mystery that no balance of payments is possible, and sometimes in light of the belief that a full account can be given and the demand that all accounts must be settled. The former understanding is inscribed into Christianity, and the latter is the viewpoint of identity politics. Consider the former first. A mass shooting occurs somewhere in America. Christians offer up their, quote, thoughts and prayers. They do this because they understand that in the invisible spiritual economy, prayers for the deceased innocents are heard by God, and not just prayers for the recently dead, but for the dead of ages past. That is why in the invisible spiritual economy, prayers for the recently deceased are as efficacious as our prayers for African slaves who died on their way to or on American soil hundreds of years ago. For those oriented by the material economy, this is senseless gibberish. A transgression has occurred and it must be paid for, say by changing gun laws, or if we're 1865 and we could actually count the cost by making reparations for slavery. Material suffering requires a material recompense. The balance of payments in the visible economy must be observed. In the invisible economy, on the other hand, payments never quite balance, at least not in our lifetimes. The innocent suffer, and we do not know why. Good people die, bad people live. Christian prayer begins and ends with the inconvertible fact of the imbalance of payments. Innocent people were gunned down. Where were the scales of justice? Innocent slaves died wretched deaths. Where were the scales of justice? The material economy promises much. But because of the incontrovertible fact of the imbalance of payments, the invisible spiritual economy can never be supervened by the visible economy. Money, time, and materials render a portion of our life coherent and manageable, but not all of it. The justice of payment alone does not fully comprehend the world. Uncompensated suffering and mercy too have their place in the invisible balance sheet of life that only God understands. So declares the Christian. We live in two economies. The one involves payments made and payments received. The other something deeper and more impenetrable. An economy within which we are to prayerfully abide, but which we cannot alter. The portrayal of Christ by Judas in the Gospel of Matthew illuminates the collision between these two economies. Judas, the treasurer for the disciples, the one who weighs and measures in the visible economy, is incensed that expensive ointment has been poured out on Jesus' head. The ointment could have been sold and the proceeds given to the poor. Jesus replies, "The poor will always be with you." Which is to say, there is an invisible economy in which the scales of justice do not balance in the way that Judas wants them to. Concluding that Judas is not the revolutionary Jesus is not the revolutionary that Judas had expected him to be, Judas betrays Christ for silver coin, which he presumably wants to use to help balance the scales of justice in the visible economy. For the Christian, try as he may, man cannot resolve the imbalance of payments in the invisible economy. Only God can, and he will not do so until the end of history. A no less remarkable distinction between the two economies occurs at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem to be counted and taxed, to be included in the bookkeeping of payments that the world records. The birth of Jesus does not happen in the inn, however, but rather in a sheltering place for animals, probably a cave, where Mary lays him in a food trough, a manger. He is invisible to the world that payments record. He comes to give relief in the other economy that is beyond price, the economy that man cannot control. Now, identity politics is also concerned with the invisible spiritual economy that dwells alongside the visible economy. Much has been written about identity politics, but little of it comprehends identity politics as an attempted exposition, distorted though it may be, of the mysterious invisible economy that we cannot escape. Identity politics comprehends this invisible economy in terms of the relationship between transgression and innocence, between purportedly monovalent groups, white heterosexual men on the one hand, and blacks, women, persons who identify as LGBTQ, and persons who identify with other identity groups on the other hand. These groups are, of course, visible. This makes the calculus complicated. Identity politics is concerned with the invisible economy of transgression and innocence, but it seeks to understand that invisible economy in terms of the relationship between visible groups. In the world that identity politics constructs, for example, it is axiomatic that, quote, systemic racism of one visible group toward another runs so deep that it cannot even be measured. Although it is invisible, it is real. On the other hand, therefore, we're asked to ignore the visible economic relations between members of visible groups when, say, white heterosexual men are considerably poorer than members of groups that identity politics declares to be among the innocents. On the other hand, when the economic relations are reversed and white heterosexual men are economically wealthier, identity politics declares that the deeper cause of this visible imbalance is the systemic racism in the invisible economy of transgression and innocence in which both groups are involved. Identity politics always maintains the purity of the innocents and the stain of the transgressors, regardless of any visible evidence to the contrary. White heterosexual men who are the least among us, quoting Luke, are therefore invisible within the world identity politics constructs. That is why the devastation of the opioid crisis among whites in America has not captured the attention of those who live in the world that identity politics constructs, and why Hillary Clinton ignored and castigated a vast swath of the American electorate and lost the 2016 presidential election. Adherents of identity politics are untroubled by the necessity of oscillating back and forth between ignoring the visible evidence in the case of poor white heterosexual men and singularly fixating on it in the case of richer white heterosexual men. In the world identity politics constructs, the visible economy either tells us nothing or it is invested with the significance that the visible world does not warrant. That is one of the consequences of attempting to render an invisible economy of transgression and innocence in terms of the relationship between two visible groups. White heterosexual men are either invisible or they are the hidden cause of every visible transgression in the world. The Democratic Party cannot win national elections if its candidates continue to think this way. This paradox and its political implications aside, the identity politics fixation on the invisible spiritual economy has not received the attention it deserves. The predominant account of identity politics today treats identity as if it pertains to different kinds of people. This sort of analysis misses much. It has been long understood, as early as the 1830s, when Tocqueville wrote about it, that as we become more connected and are disconnected and our lives get smaller and smaller in the democratic age, the temptation to make distinctions between others and ourselves grows. When we are lost in a lonely crowd, we look for ways to distinguish ourselves. Our imagination wanders, and our pride demands more than numbing anonymity. Surely we're more than a flickering soliloquy that emerges out of nothing and returns to the dust. To escape this fate, is it any wonder that so many Americans today turn to genetic testing services like 23andMe in the hope of discovering who they really are? We do not want anonymity. We want to be somebody. Services like 23andMe tell us who we are. We are little of this kind and a little of that kind. This need to have something to define us and distinguish us from the crowd is an important development and certainly contributes to the fracturing of our politics. Loneliness and anonymity, however, are not the only reasons for the popularity of services like 23andMe. In addition to telling us about the larger kind of which we are an instance, we also want some assurance that some marker of our inheritance provides immutable proof that in the invisible economy from which we cannot escape, we can be counted among the innocents rather than among the transgressors. The need, so amply documented since the 1960s, to stand out from the lonely crowd, to express our individuality, is today intermixed with, if not eclipsed by, another need. The need to be counted as a member of the innocent groups within the invisible economy of transgression and innocence, on which identity politics fixates. Identity politics is not about who we are as individuals. It is about the stain and purity associated with who we are as members of groups. Identity politics is not satisfied with the Christian understanding that there will be an imbalance of payments always, which only God can redress through his infinite mercy. Identity politics demands a complete accounting so that the score can be settled once and for all, or if it cannot be settled, then held over the head of the transgressors like a guillotine in perpetuity. That is why establishing what one group owes another is central to the identity politics enterprise. The complete accounting that is needed requires ongoing investigations that clarify just how stained the transgressors are and how pure the innocents are. This now seems to be the singular task of our colleges and universities, which have thoroughly renounced their ancient charge, dating to the founding of Plato's Academy in 387 BC, of assisting students in ascending from mere opinion to knowledge and wisdom. Once many of our American colleges and universities were Christian. Increasingly embarrassed by this, over the course of the 19th and the 20th centuries, they adopted the Greek ideal of knowledge and wisdom. Now in the 21st century, They have returned to the Christian fixation on transgression and innocence. The new version of that Christian fixation, however, makes no allowance for the long-standing Christian way of understanding either transgression or innocence, namely as a relationship first and foremost between God and man. God is nowhere to be found in the identity politics accounting scheme. Neither is forgiveness, which would erase the scores altogether and leave us with no score to settle. Defenders of identity politics often claim to be egalitarians concerned with existing inequalities. Yet who among them, I wonder, could actually endure the radical equality that would result if we were to erase the debt and innocence points that we are now told in the most precise terms through intersectionality we owe or are owed, and meet each other unencumbered face to face. Perhaps Christians who actually understood the fantastic claim that regardless of their kind, they are all equally adopted sons and daughters of God could do that. Identity politics, notwithstanding its debt to Christianity and its surface profession of faith, both in equality and in the sanctity of the individual, wants only a hierarchy of transgression and innocence. Here is the tribalism that awaits us, based on our purportedly permanent inheritance of stain or purity. Christian radical equality, hoped for but not yet implemented on earth, is through its identity politics stepchild, currently being supplanted by a strange sort of anti-egalitarian spiritual eugenics, according to which the pure and innocent groups must ascend and the stained transgressor groups must be purged. Other religions use the language of purity and stain, of transgression and innocence, but our long familiarity with Christianity in America means that the invocation of these categories within identity politics derives from Christianity. Most of what I say here is concerned with the deeply deformed relationship between identity politics and Christianity. Surveys may indicate that Americans have lost or are losing their religion. The fever of identity politics that now sweeps the nation suggests that these surveys are looking in the wrong place and asking the wrong questions. Americans have not lost their religions. America has relocated their religion to the realm of politics. The institutional separation between church and state may be largely intact, but the separation between religion and politics has largely collapsed. More precisely, with respect to the matter of the presumption of guilt and innocence, they have traded places. Once, because of the doctrine of original sin, there was a presumption of guilt in the churches, and because of our legal history, a presumption of innocence in the realm of politics. Today, the abandonment of the doctrine of original sin has had the curious effect of lifting the burden of guilt in the churches and shifting it to politics. Whatever the law may say about our innocence, the presumption of identity politics is that man, or rather the white heterosexual man, is guilty. This is a dangerous reversal of legal norms that the Anglo-American tradition took centuries to develop and to take hold. The identity politics of innocence, as I call it, has transformed politics. It has turned politics into a religious venue of sacrificial offering. Ponder for a moment the Christian understanding of sacrificial offering. Without the sacrifice of Christ, the innocent Lamb of God, there would be no Christianity. Christ, the scapegoat, renders the impure pure by taking upon himself the sins of the world. In purging the divine scapegoat, those for whom he is the sacrificial offering are purified. Identity politics is a political version of this cleansing for groups rather than for individuals. The scapegoat identity politics offers up for sacrifice as the white heterosexual man. If purged, its adherents imagine, the world itself, along with the remaining groups within it, will be cleansed of stain. Without exception, every major action item of the Democratic Party today is traceable to this supposition. The Democratic Party pushed back against national borders. Its unwavering insistence that fundamental political and economic transformations are necessary to address climate change, its disgust with dirty fossil fuels, its demand for wealth redistribution, and its resolve that every mediating institution in which citizens gather must be altered so as to become, quote, inclusive. All of these have their root in the supposition that the nation state, market commerce, the petrochemicals that fuel it, the conventional generative family, our civic institutions, and our religious institutions are unclean or obsolete because of the hand white heterosexual man has had in building and in maintaining them. We can and should talk about the pressing issues before us. Self-government requires nothing less. Substantive deliberation cannot occur, however, if adherents of identity politics are animated by the angry need for catharsis, as the desire to scapegoat always is. Calling someone a racist, misogynist, homophobe, transphobe, Islamophobe, fascist, Nazi, hater, denier, or any such name is cathartic. These words carry with them the power to banish and to exile. Once they have been uttered, the comportment of both parties changes visibly. The accuser beams with the iridescent light of discharged rage. The accuser slinks into the darkness, shamed by the leprosy of his irredeemable stain. An unbridgeable chasm has opened up between them. They stand on opposite sides of an impenetrable border wall within a community of which they were both members a few short minutes ago. Identity politics adherents declare that visible borders between nations should be abolished. There will always be borders, however. Abolish them in one place and they will reemerge in another. Identity politics erects invisible borders between the pure and the stained. Too many of the political declarations we hear today intend only to banish fellow citizens. Neither conversations about nor actions taken in response to our pressing problems are possible if the deeper purpose of a political program, perhaps even more important than the political program itself, which is but a pretext, is to purge a group or humiliate members into silence. However enfeebled today, Christianity has burned itself into the soul of Western man, and for now at least, hold us back from the real impetus behind identity politics, which is actual group purgation. We will see what the future brings. Christianity's deepest insight, perennially violated by Christians themselves, is that no mortal group can cover over the sins of anyone. Historically understood, this insight is a staggering breakthrough, so rare as to be exceptional, since most of human history bears witness to the conviction that the catharsis of group scapegoating does restore the cleanliness of the community. Writing nearly a century before Tocqueville, Jean-Jacques Rousseau noted in 1759 that prior to the advent of Christianity, political war was also theological war. The dominion of the gods were, so to speak, determined by the boundaries of nations. Far from men fighting for gods, it was, as in Homer, the gods who fought for men. By this, Rousseau meant to give some indication of the rage that scapegoating another nation often involved. So cathartic was its ecstatic revelry that gods had to be invoked as a cause. Christianity, he mournfully declared, had put an end to that and had diminished politics ever since. Perhaps Rousseau was premature in his assessment that the ancient gods had died away. We find ourselves at a remarkable impasse. Identity politics wishes to return us to the unexceptional condition, to the pre-Christian condition. One group in its current form, the white heterosexual man, is avowed to be the transgressor. All others, women, Black, Hispanics, LGBTQ persons, have their sins of omission or commission covered over by scapegoating this group. Set against the exceptional Christian understanding that man's transgression, his sin, is original, that is set against the Christian understanding that man's transgression is sin and that it is original with him. This means that it's always already there before any lineage of inheritance constitutes him as a kind, and therefore that group scapegoating cannot absolve him of his impurity. Hide behind your identity if you wish. Your anxiety about your own transgressions will not dissipate. Displace your anxiety by relentlessly aiming the arrow of accusation outward toward other groups. The haunting of specter of transgression will not disappear. Its source is deeper than identity politics comprehends. The arrangement that identity politics specifies has placed the scapegoated white heterosexual man in a very curious position. In order to escape cathartic rage, he must prove his innocence by virtue signaling, or more accurately, by innocence signaling, his support for various social justice causes, so that he, like other groups of innocents, can be covered with righteousness. Only when covered in this way does the cathartic rage that brings social death pass over him and settle elsewhere, as it must. The Hebrews of ancient times were told by God that death would pass over their houses, and no one in their households would die if they marked their front doors with innocent blood from a slain lamb. Today in America, the white heterosexual man must reenact a version of this innocent signaling liturgy if social death is to pass him over. Jews in America celebrate Passover once a year. If cathartic rage is to pass over the white heterosexual man, he must celebrate the identity politics version of this liturgy daily by displaying signs of innocence on his front door, or more likely, his office door for all to see. If you doubt this, wander through the university or college buildings in America that house the offices of our professors. You will soon discover ample evidence of the strange identity politics Passover ritual. Decals that declare, "This office is green," pictures of Michel Foucault, dated posters announcing Martin Luther King celebrations, an announcement about upcoming diversity training, yet another New York Times article taped to a professor's door that thinly masks its hatred of Donald Trump. If you display these symbols of your innocence, or if your sympathy or of your sympathy toward the innocence, social death will surely pass you by. The displays on the office doors of corporate America are no different. Try as he may, however, the circumstance of the white heterosexual man can never be altered. Because of his permanent transgressive status, he begins with a deficit of innocence points and must fight his way back to a zero balance, which is as far as he can ever advance. In the Garden of Eden, Adam hid behind a fig leaf. In identity politics, the white heterosexual man can attempt to hide behind the fig leaf of social justice, Black Lives Matter, etc., to find temporary reprieve, but the leaf is see-through, and his nakedness is always visible for all to see. In the Garden of Eden, God could see Adam's nakedness. So too can members of groups that identify that identity politics counts among the innocents see the nakedness of the white heterosexual man. Like God, they declare his irredeemable guilt. Now, I want to be very clear. By alerting you to the theological perversity of replacing the divine scapegoat of Christianity with the all too mortal white heterosexual man as the scapegoat, I am not saying that white heterosexual man is innocent, as many who claim that they are on the alt-right declare. Far from it. If anything, as the careful listener has already discovered, I wish to save the category of transgression in all of its depth, and I fear that both identity politics and the alt-right will end up stripping the category of its profound Christian significance, which will deprive us of hope. On the contrary, I am saying that in the world that identity politics constructs, the white heterosexual man becomes more than who he really is. He becomes a member of a scapegoated group who takes away the sins of the world rather than being a mortal of mixed inheritance like everyone else involved in transgression and searching for redemption. The deepest mystery of transgression and innocence cannot be understood by focusing our attention on groups. That is the Christian claim. That was the claim of Martin Luther Jr. King, and that is the claim I make as well. Not one group is unequivocally pure or stained, and without the ability to establish such purity, just who the transgressors are and who the innocents are is impossible to determine. Identity politics stands or falls on the claim that groups are unities of transgressors or innocents, and that the invisible spiritual economy from which we cannot escape can be understood in terms of purity or stain that inheres in each visible group. I think with that, I will stop. I'm looking forward to our conversation in the near future. There's much more I could say, but I think we'll have an ample opportunity to discuss this shortly. Take care. Josh Mitchell from Georgetown.